Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tonellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Affirm Press. Listeners, today I'm so excited to introduce you to another Aussie author whose book simply floored me. Fiona Hardy, a writer, bookseller and reviewer from Melbourne, is the author of a new book published by Affirm Press earlier this year called Unbury the Dead, a contemporary crime fiction novel about two best friends who are hired to undertake some morally questionable activities and who then find themselves caught up in a deadly high-stakes drama. Fast-paced, gritty and compulsive, Fiona Hardy is a talented, fresh new voice in Australian crime literature, and I'm simply thrilled to have the chance to chat with her on the podcast today. Welcome, Fiona.
Thanks so much, Claudine. You know, it's funny, when I listen to your podcast, I hear a lot of people say, that's such a nice introduction, and I get it. That was really lovely. Thank you.
And I wanted to say formally, congratulations on the book. You must be so proud to see it out in the world.
Thank you. Yes, I am. It's been really lovely. It's been in quite a lot of places as well. And I've had my friends send me pictures, like from Sydney Airport. One of my friends went to all of the stores in Sydney Airport and all the terminals reported back that it was there. I was in a Big W the other day and I saw a stand that had a pile kind of flat and then a pile that was face out. And as well, I'm like, oh, this is so nice. And I picked up the face out one and it was actually in front of another book. I thought to myself, this feels like one of my friends has been here and has just put my book in front of somebody else's. So that's been nice, I guess.
I love that. I love that about the bookish community, that we're out there, you know, furtively putting people's books out the front so that we make sure that people are looking and buying our books. I love that. It's so wonderful.
And it wasn't another Australian author, so I didn't have to feel too bad about it.
Yes, even better. Now, something I neglected to mention in my introduction is that this is not your first published book. In fact, you've written a number of books for kids, including the CBCA notable How to Make a Movie in 12 Days and How to Write the Soundtrack to Your Life, which won the Children's Peace Literature Award. Incredible. But Unbury the Dead is your debut adult fiction title. So I wanted to ask you, Fiona, did you always think that you would write an adult novel, and not only an adult novel, but a crime novel?
It's funny. I've been writing books since I was 5 years old. I guess books is probably not the term for what a 5-year-old is writing, but I've been writing since I was 5 years old. When I was actually in my 20s, I was more writing kind of, I guess, just contemporary literature, just talking through all of my feelings about being in my 20s, I guess, just working through life. And so back then I would have said it was just straight literature all up. I'd always been reading crime. I'd always been a big fan of crime, and working in a bookshop as I do, I'd been trying to be across quite a lot of genres. So I'd always been reading kids' books even before I had kids as well. But definitely, there'd always been something in my mind about crime. It's such a fun genre. I've always really loved it. While I was working on my kids' books with much longer titles, I have to say, Unbury the Dead is much more punchy and easy to remember, even for me. While I was working on those kids' books, I was writing reviews for the newsletter for the bookshop that I work at, and it was the crime column, basically. So I was reviewing about 8 to 10 crime books a month. And while I was writing all of those reviews, I was reading so much crime and just learning so much. And there's so much good crime out there. I was going through a few different phases, like I went through the Scandinavian crime and all the psychological Gone Girl type stuff as well. And while I was reading all of those, I guess I was always thinking to myself, oh, if I was going to write a book, this is what it wouldn't have this. Maybe it would have this. Picking out the bits that I liked and the bits that I didn't like and really thinking about it. So, and this has been in my mind in some form or another for a particularly long time as well. I'd actually originally come up with a plot line, a twist basically, that I thought was genius. And I never ever managed to actually properly figure out how to make it work. I'd invented Teddy and Alice to help me try and figure out this twist that I'd written, and they couldn't figure it out because I couldn't figure it out. We never managed to make that plot work. So I had to write something different for them instead. So that had been years in the making originally. And then there was writing this plot line, and then there was getting signed, and then there was editing. There's been quite a lot of years of work trying to get Unbury the Dead from the kernel of maybe I could write a crime book one day to actually having a completed crime book in my hand.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, my next question was going to be, was this your first attempt at writing a novel?
Well, actually, no. I had written another crime book. It was, I guess, must have been during the early Jane Harper rural crime kind of vibe because I set it in a rural country town. And the main character was a suburban person, but most of it was set in a country town, very rural vibes. And I have to say, I'm a very suburban type of girl. I grew up in the suburbs. I still live in the suburbs. Actually, very rarely go to the country. So I think I was maybe doing a lot of learning in that point, learning about how to make a crime book work, how to keep it punchy, how to make a twist kind of, well, not a twist, but, surprise work, I guess. And I did learn a lot from that. I did try and kind of get it out there a little bit. I sent it to one person and they were like, nah, not quite. And then I gave it to somebody else to read who was in the country and they were like, I think maybe you're not quite there yet. And that was, I'm going to say maybe 12 years ago, but I could be a bit wrong on that. I'm not sure, quite a while ago. And I definitely did take some away from that. There were things that I wrote in that I think were good. There was ideas that I had that were compelling. I've always, I guess, enjoyed writing about not from the point of view of police or maybe not a professional detective. I love to read crime with police and professional detectives and things like that. But I guess as far as writing, it's always been a bit more fun to be on the edges of that, working it out, getting it wrong, not being upheld by the law. Not that people in fiction often are anyway, otherwise it wouldn't be fun. So yes, definitely not my first attempt, but my first, I guess, serious attempt that I wrote and rewrote and worked on over and over.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, we talked a little bit about this just before we started recording. And, I mentioned the fact that crime is such a very crowded space at the moment. Almost everybody you encounter, particularly in the Australian writing community, is attempting crime or wanting to write crime. And it's difficult, I think, to create something unique and fresh. And I think that's what you've done here. So I wanted to ask you, Fiona, where did the inspiration for this story come from?
Well, I guess when I was writing Teddy and Alice at one point and I was working on other ideas, kind of just, I don't know, it's hard to explain. Just, I'd get Teddy and I'd get Alice and I'd just wake up one morning and think, what if they did this? And write maybe two sentences of something. And then usually it wouldn't actually become anything. I started working on a short story about Alice, who in Unbury the Dead is a driver. She's driving a hearse. And in this short story that I started, she was driving a hearse with a dead body in it. And then she was on a dark road, and then two people pull her over, and she's in her car and she's thinking, all right, what am I going to do? How am I going to defend myself? And she reaches for a gun. And that was actually the end of the story that I got to. But that was what I took away. And I thought to myself, oh, okay. So the story of a car with a hearse and they're on a long trip and things are happening. That's kind of what Unbury the Dead, I guess, grew from in a way. That, along with a few characters that had already been settling in my mind as well. The idea of Choker, who is their boss. Teddy and Alice both work for Choker, who is he thinks that he's a good guy, but he is just a crime boss, basically, sending his staff out on terrible, morally unjust, sometimes morally just assignments as well. And he'd been there a little bit in my mind. I like the idea of having somebody who was a bad guy, like objectively a bad guy, but kind of thought that he was a good guy. And we didn't always hate either. Having characters like that was a fun part of it for me, to be honest. So I guess it started with characters. It starts in a lot of different ways. It's hard to pinpoint an exact moment apart from the hearse, but yeah, it just grows. It just keeps growing.
Yeah, you've touched on some fantastic aspects of this story. So I wondered, for the readers who've yet to discover your book, could you tell us more about the story?
Of course. So at the start of Unbury the Dead, we have Teddy and Alice, who are these two women in their late 20s, and they both work for Choker doing odd jobs. They're problem solvers, private detectives. They've got a lot of different titles. And at the start of this, so Teddy's taking the dead body of Australia's richest man to its final resting place in regional Victoria before anyone in Australia finds out that he's dead. And then we have Teddy, and she's on a missing persons case in suburban Melbourne. Nobody seems to really care about this missing guy, but she does, because Teddy is a person that cares. And the first part of the book, there's parallel chapters where we have Teddy driving around Melbourne with her sometime colleague, Art. And then we have Alice as well, driving around, visiting particular places that she had to stop with her hearse before she gets to the final destination as well. And about halfway through the book, something happens. It's violent and traumatic to both Teddy and Alice, and they have to spend the rest of the book figuring out what justice means in a situation like what they've just gone through.
Yeah, as I said, a really fresh and unique perspective on the crime story, really. And I must confess, and I did say this to you before we started recording, but while I was reading, I kept thinking that Alice and Teddy was the slightly dodgy version of Charlie's Angels. They were two highly intelligent, resourceful, kick-ass women who operated just outside of the law. And so I guess I was thinking about, and you mentioned that, these characters have been with you for a little while, but was there anything in particular that inspired them or somebody that you met, or were they purely a product of your imagination?
I think one reason that I wanted to be a bit younger was because of all the crime books I read. And as I said, I love all types of crime books. This isn't really a judgment call, but a lot of them involved, especially when I was kind of first on the crime scene, older detectives, maybe a man in his 50s who was divorced and he wakes up at the start of the book and he looks in the mirror and he's sad that his wife has left him and he needs a beer to get started for the day, that kind of thing. And I was a bit like, I just wanted something a little bit different. And when The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo came out and Elizabeth Salander was in her 20s, I thought that that was really something new. Like she was an amazing character. And so definitely didn't base it on her, but I loved when I was in my 20s reading about somebody who was in their 20s solving crimes and fixing problems. And so even though sadly I'm no longer in my 20s, I still wanted to keep that. I wanted to have something out there for the, I don't want to say younger readers, that's not really what I mean, but just mix it up a little bit. And it was like a time of, some kind of freedom and a bit of fearlessness, I guess, as well. And so that's something that's been fun to have in Teddy and Alice, to make them a bit younger. And we've got Alice who's got a child, so they're not necessarily just, running around doing youthful 20s things their whole time. But I really wanted to kind of embrace that kind of tone in it as well. And I don't think they were really based on anyone. They're definitely not based on me. I was not really that interesting in my 20s, unfortunately, or now. But they are based on, I guess, a lot of the women in my life and how I would imagine them reacting in these types of situations. As you say, they're very resourceful. I have a lot of resourceful people in my life. And if I put them in problems, they would get stuff done. So that's what I kind of hoped for. Not really any particular person in my mind, but just an amalgamation of all the great and interesting women that I know.
Fiona, I think what you've done, or what you've managed to do exceptionally well in this story, is show us that despite the high stakes nature of the work that Alice and Teddy were engaged in, they were ordinary women in many ways. Alice had a young family, Teddy was grieving the loss of her beloved father, and above all else, they loved each other and their families fiercely. They were unexpected, and despite their activities, also had some strong ethical boundaries. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the ethical boundaries, I think, was the most interesting part, because you want to make your characters maybe morally dubious enough to keep them interesting, but you don't want to turn readers off by making them terrible people making bad decisions all the time. At the start of the book, we kind of get an idea that they had recently been assaulting somebody essentially for money. But then we hear that those people are bad people. So then the reader's like, oh, I guess that's okay then. Maybe we're happy about that. I don't know. And we hear about other jobs that they've done in their time and the things that they've done. And I want to kind of maintain that level of confusion, I guess, where you're not sure about the characters, but I always want people to stay on the right side of them. I want them to be characters that people like. So they're loyal to each other. They're good to their families. They are good people who, they wouldn't litter. They're like, on a small scale, they're good people. And you just have to kind of, I guess, confront some thoughts yourself about what you would do in these types of situations. If you had been brought up like Teddy had been, where this has been the job that her father had done his whole life before she joined it as well, what else would you do? You know that this is a way to make money. As far as you know that this is still pretty good thing to do. You're sometimes hurting some bad people, and if you're hurting some good people, I mean, it's fine, because like on the balance, you're probably a good person, right? So I really enjoyed that part of it, the aspect of them not being perfect people. I mean, I guess that's also in most crime books. You have that even with the police. Often they've got something dubious in their background as well, but yeah, that's one of the things I really most enjoyed, I think, was creating their characters and trying to find that perfect balance.
Yeah, indeed. I think you've done it exceptionally well. And I wondered if we could talk about the missing persons case that Teddy is tasked with solving, just for a moment there, because we were talking about this idea that they are sort of operating on the edges of the law, but I think that they have still have some strong ethical boundaries. And I think the scenes of the book dealing with this case were some of the most poignant, and in which we see Teddy struggling to come to terms with what has happened to this young man. And at the heart of her search is this young man who is, by all accounts, quite a sad man. And the more she investigates, the more she learns about his life, and especially his parents, who seem to lack the most basic decency where their son is concerned. They were more concerned about their missing possessions than they were concerned about his whereabouts. Was this something you were deliberate about in dealing with in this book?
I love that you've taken so much time to think about that question, because it was a big part for me, was thinking about Cole, this young man, and creating somebody that nobody would seem to be really sad about. And even Teddy's Art, who Teddy works with, even he was a little bit indifferent about it. He's like, this kid's just gone missing. And everyone in this guy's life is like, oh, he's just gone somewhere. We don't really mind. Whereas Teddy was like the only person who was thinking, well, he's a person of worth and he's a person of value and we need to find him. And it doesn't matter that, maybe he was just not the most interesting of people. And he's a bit of a bummer to be around, is what we kind of gather from all of his friends. But that doesn't mean it's okay to go missing. And it really reveals to Teddy as well. She's like, well, I'm not always a good person either. Does that mean that no, it's not, I'm not worth looking after as well? No one's going to look out for me. Would no one bother searching for me? And for her, because she's grappling with that sense of self-worth, I guess, through the whole book, it really hurts her to see how indifferent people are to Cole, especially when, even though she's got quite a small circle, those people care for her greatly. And she's so sad for Cole that he doesn't have that. And so she's really, really determined that she's going to try and figure out what happened, even if nobody else is interested. That's something she wants to do. And it's something that I wanted to do. And I really wanted to make Cole somebody. He was another interesting character, right? Because he was somebody who wasn't likable in a more mundane kind of way. But I wanted people to still be invested in him being found and her search for him as well.
That was a brilliant part of the book, and I really enjoyed that. I think at its core, this book is about female friendship and having someone who always has your back. Why was this something you were keen to explore in the novel?
It's funny, I think as I've gotten older, I really enjoy reading friendships in books. Just it's one of my favorite types of relationship, the finding of friendships, new friendships, things like that. I think it's because something I take quite seriously in my own life, always trying to make friends with everybody who I encounter, no matter where I am. And I've got a child, and so she's starting all these sports. And so every time I go to a sport, I'm like, all right, who am I going to be friends with today? Better think about this. Just very intense. Okay, not intense as a friend, but intense about taking friendship seriously, I guess. And I really enjoy reading about other people. Romance is great, and I love romance as a genre, but I almost wish there was like friendship romance as a genre as well, where you could just read about people becoming pals and hanging out all the time. And I think it's hard for a lot of us to become friends with new people. While I wanted to kind of, I guess, explore that in a way, it was interesting to see how I could create a friendship that people were really going to love. These are two women that had been in my mind for so long and for such a long time before even this book was written, that I had really created a friendship that was quite solid in my mind. And so by the time this book came around, while it wasn't always easy to write, I found their communication with each other quite easy, because I just knew what they would say to each other. I knew what they would know the other one was doing. I'm working on something else at the moment, and they're definitely not psychic. They're just intuitive. They have been around each other long enough that they just understand what the other does. And it was just the kind of extent of a friendship where often when a friend might text you and you can read between the lines and you think, there's something else going on today. I'm going to ask them more questions and see how they're going. And level you come up with any kind of relationship, whether it is friendship, romance, or parents, children, things like that, where you can really understand somebody else. I thought it was interesting to explore that on more of a friendship level and have them not actually have any conflict. I didn't want them to have, not really of a spoiler of the book, but they never fight with each other during the book. And I really enjoyed that, where they can fight about other people. There's conflict with other people in the book, but just never with each other. They always have each other's backs.
And I think one of the most pivotal scenes in this book is where I think Alice texts Teddy and she doesn't respond, and she just goes, oh, she's concerned about her. And it's like that intuitive communication between friends that I think is so lovely in this book. They didn't often have to talk to understand where each other was coming from.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
it's been wonderful. A really fun part of it.
This book does to some extent touch on the idea that both Alice and Teddy weren't taken seriously by men, or that men, particularly dangerous men, underestimated their ability to defend themselves or indeed to be a threat to them. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
That was actually another thing that I really enjoyed, because, I'm realistic that if you put a man and a woman in a fist fight together, the man is going to win. Even if we have Teddy and Alice, who are professionals, they know what they're doing. They can fight back, but they have to use a kind of different level of cleverness. They can pretend like they don't know what they're doing, that they're a little bit helpless, but they have figured out a way already to fight back. They know when to use things to their benefit. They know how to use each other as distraction. They are not unwilling to bring a gun to a fist fight, because that's the way you might win that fight. So I did try to keep it realistic that they are not going to win every fight, because they are real people and they are not superheroes, unfortunately, even though they are a little bit in my head, not entire superheroes. So I did enjoy creating, every time there was an actual kind of fight scene, trying to negotiate that did take a lot of work as well, to think about how that would work with other people. And as a long-term reader of crime with women in it, I've always enjoyed when, women can kind of surprise with how they can fight back, or how they can win, maybe not even physical battle, but a mental one as well. And it's always been something that I've really loved. And I really enjoy the way that the tagline for my book is "They messed with the wrong women." Like, it was such a It was a really good one that my publisher came up with. I'm like, yeah, you know what? That's great. Excellent. Love it. No notes.
That's exactly right. They did mess with the wrong women. In the press release that came with your book, Fiona, there was a short bio about you, which said something like, Fiona is sorry to the people of ASIO who have probably seen her alarming Google search history. And I have to say, reading the book and some of the nefarious subject matter you traverse, I did think the same thing about your Google search history. But on a more serious note, I imagine that there was quite a bit of research that went into the novel. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
It's interesting. I think because they are not professionals, there was a certain level of research that I almost deliberately didn't do because I wanted to keep it a little bit loose, that they didn't always know what they were doing. They were experts, but they weren't going to go about this in a completely professional kind of way. A lot of the research, I guess, I've taken over like 20 years of quite intense crime reading as well. Like, I feel like there's a lot of knowledge I have. I have read like a few books on forensics and things like that. So I like to think I've got a fair amount of baseline knowledge. I'm not going to say that I'm a professional in the field. I am not an actual criminal. So unfortunately, I can't really tell you what it's like to do any of these crimes because I haven't done anything. I'm sorry. I'm just a big square who works in a bookshop, lives in a house, lives happily, not doing any wrongs, but enjoying reading about it and enjoying writing about it as well. There is a lot of kind of the most bizarre research as well. I've talked about this when I had my launch recently as well, that there's a lot of mundane research you do into somebody having a job, and then you delete that character later on, and all of a sudden all that knowledge you had about a specific person has just completely gone. I spent far too long once trying to figure out whether the plural of cornettos was OS or OES. And that was about half an hour of my life that I couldn't get back. And later on realized, well, why didn't I just decide to change it to magnums instead? But no, I was determined that it was going to be cornettos. And so that's what I maintained. There was some more gory kind of things that I guess I had to look into guns. I had to look into cars as well. So I had some kind of knowledge about that. Valkyrie, the car that Alice is driving, which is a classic car, actually changed a couple of times because I would find one that was perfect and then realize that that couldn't be converted into a hearse, or how I visualized she was inside, it couldn't be quite the same. And while there is a little bit of leeway because it is fiction and, you have to sometimes make things work the way that you can, I wanted to be as close as I possibly could to reality as well. There are, some more gorier things. I really dread to think. I had a very kind friend who made me a certificate from ASIO that excused and allowed all things that I was searching personally from ASIO, she says, signed by my friend, so that I could do whatever I wanted and that they wouldn't think that I was doing anything wrong. So I've got that certificate up now, feeling very proud of myself for that. I can get away with all the things that I'm looking up.
Oh, I love that so much. What was the most interesting thing that your research uncovered, apart from the OES or OS for cornettos?
Actually, there was an interesting discussion. I'm trying to think how I can word it without giving too much away. Teddy, every now and again, isn't really averse to relieving somebody of a finger, to be honest. And we were talking at one point about if you needed to do anything further with that finger, how would you make that work? And it was a quite long discussion that I ended up having with my editor about the mechanics of basically fingerprinting with a loose finger that wasn't on the body anymore. And it was just we couldn't really land on what the actual reality of that was, but we got pretty close. It was an interesting discussion trying to figure out what we thought would work. I guess that was probably the most bizarre thing. And then, yes, learning a lot more about guns than I really felt comfortable knowing, but that's okay, I guess.
Yeah, indeed. All for a good purpose, I would say. You mentioned Valkyrie just a moment ago, and she, as you said, she's the car in the story, and she's almost a character in herself. She's a blue 1937 Rolls-Royce Phantom 3. Not exactly an inconspicuous car to be driving a coffin around in. Why this car?
I think because the person who wanted her to drive him, so who had put in his will that he wanted her to take him somewhere, wanted to do so with style, I think. And that's also a car. She doesn't always use it as a hearse. Sometimes she just drives it around with people because it is such a beautiful car. People love it. They love to look at it. And she drives around a lot of rich people. Like, one of her jobs is just basically as a chauffeur. And people love to talk about it. They love to look at it. And so the people in that car like to be seen. They like to be acknowledged. And so this person, yes, while they kind of were trying to get somewhere without being known what was going on, they wanted to do so in style, basically. She loves that car. That car always responds to her. It's her favorite one in Choker's fleet of cars. And she knew that she could drive that one well, that it's a reliable car for her, despite being very old now. And I think it was just something that I really loved visually. I guess there's always been a sense of, well, when my book's made into a movie, of course, this is what it'll look like. And the idea of driving around something a lot more interesting, blue, vintage, rather than just the kind of everyday hearse that you might see and get sad about, was just a little bit more cinematic, let's say.
Fiona, there were a lot of moving parts to this story. There was a long cast of characters and locations which the characters visit, also many red herrings. So I guess it begs the question, are you a plotter or a pantser? Did you know how it would all fit or who done it when you started out, or did you figure it out along the way?
I figured it out along the way, to be honest. I've always been, I think that it'll get there eventually type of person. And so I usually kind of write, I guess, probably about 30,000 words before I start to get a real idea of who these people are, who we need to be suspicious of, who I've suddenly become suspicious of without even realizing that I was going to be. And so often at that point, I'll kind of go back, reconstruct everything, have realized what's going to happen at the end, and create a more tight plot. And I usually don't start again because that way lies just, over editing and never achieving. So I'll probably still hammer all the way to the end, and then maybe some things at the start don't make sense anymore, but that's what rewrites are for. Yeah, so a little bit of both, I would say. I've usually just got a kernel of an idea, roll with that until it kind of becomes where I need to actually do something a little bit more precise, and then I'll do some more precise plotting. But even if you do that, when you're going along the way, some character will say something and you're like, oh, I didn't realize, but that's something that I need to include. Okay, better go back and, mention that, better go forward and put something in about that as well. So you just got to kind of let it go. It's like the story's already out there and I'm just finding it, basically. It's what it often feels like for me.
Yeah, fantastic. I've spoken to several writers now who are either booksellers turned writers and authors or the other way around. So, what do you see as being the biggest advantage or perk of being a bookseller, and how has that influenced your writing, do you think?
Well, one of the best parts is, of course, getting quite cheap books, sometimes free books as well. I guess reading things that I might not read because there's something that I think that I should read so I can recommend, or everybody else is reading and so I want them to know about. And having to read widely in lots of genres means that you learn lots of different things about writing, what works in different kinds of genres. And it means you kind of respect writing as a whole. How does nonfiction keep things punchy when they don't know what characters are saying at the time? How do kids' books keep things so interesting for readers who might be indifferent? You're just learning a little bit of every type of genre, I think, as well. One of the things I like as well is talking to customers, of course, about books and the way that they like or don't like things that you do. You really realize, like, you'll recommend a book to them. I'll be like, here's a crime book. I really love this. And they'll be like, oh, I hated that. Okay, fine. That's okay. I can work with that kind of thing and recommend them something else, ask them some questions. But it just makes you realize that every book out there has somebody who loves it and somebody who doesn't. And so as a writer, I think that's easy to hear it when somebody doesn't like your book. It's like, that's not just me. It's every book out there has somebody who loves it and somebody who doesn't. Not every book is for everybody. And that's okay. So it makes reading reviews a little bit less hurtful when you've, offered somebody Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and they're like, oh no, it's terrible. And you're like, I mean, it's quite popular. So which is fine. And I don't really mind that at all. It's really opened my eyes to a lot of different things and to, yes, taking criticism fairly on the chin.
Fiona, what would be one thing you'd like readers to take away from this book?
It's so funny because my partner often, when I'm writing books and he's talking to me about them, he's like, what's the theme of your book? And I'm like, I don't really know. I kind of don't always really think about it. I know that's not what you're asking, but I don't think about it so much in, themes or things like that. I want people to kind of enjoy this. I want it to be more of a good time. It's not necessarily what real life is like. I think most probably criminal enterprises are just full of bad guys doing bad things all the time. So this one isn't like that. I want people to take away that this is fun, despite the sometimes serious plot lines as well. Have a good time, enjoy, have a bit of a laugh maybe as well as they go, and want to read more amazing Australian crime from other writers as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Well said. Fiona, you know that there are a lot of aspiring authors and writers who listen to this podcast. And given your successes to date, I wondered if you had some tips to share about writing or getting published.
So, one thing that I look back at now and regret is that I didn't put myself out there much. In my whole 20s, I was writing so much. Like, there are so many full manuscripts in my drawers or on floppy disks, hiding around of things that I've worked on. And I finished them and I liked them and I still think there was value in those ideas, but I just didn't ever put them out there. I think that I was just waiting for somebody to break into my computer and steal like my manuscript and publish it. I don't know what my expectations were. So I honestly think putting yourself out there is a really big thing. Don't doubt yourself. Just go, just try. The more you do it, the more you'll feel confident about doing it. You might learn some things, you might get some feedback, you might not, but every time you do it, you'll feel more confident next time. And read a lot, because the more you read, the more you'll understand about writing as a craft on the whole as well. And just keep going. So a lot of people will tell you that they want to be writers, but so infrequently people will just sit down and do it. And so you just got to sit down and do it. And every single bit of writing is worthwhile. You will learn something from everything. I mean, I've written so many short stories that never got published, but every single one has taught me something that I've used in the future. So just keep going.
That's wonderful. So, Fiona, is this the last we'll see of Alice and Teddy, or are you planning another adventure for them?
I'm actually writing two different stories about them at the moment. I actually wrote a short story about them that won the Scarlet Stiletto HQ Thriller Award, which was wonderful. That was a story called Green Thumbs. And I'm working on two different stories about them as well, like full-length novels too, that I'm doing my get to 30,000 words. I'm just taking a little bit of step away from one, and now I'm 20,000 words into another and trying to decide which plot I like more.
Well, I'm very excited to know that they're going to come back at some stage. That will be wonderful. Fiona, it's been such a pleasure talking to you today. I wish you every success with this fabulous novel, and thank you for taking the time to join me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, thank you so much, Claudine. It's been a complete delight.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.